at the bottom indicating sign-off by people in the chain of command. And this document didn't have that. This document referred to a series of conversations that the author, Mr. Haynes, had with Mr. Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld's deputy, Doug Feith, the number 3 in the Pentagon, and General Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I also really had the sense, from reading the transcript of the press conference on the 22nd of June 2004, that something was amiss. It was too slick, too well put together by serious lawyers, happened to be trained at Harvard Law School, and it suggested that these lawyers were speaking to a brief. There was something about the structure of their conversation, the attention to detail, the invocation of the same themes. So what I decided to do was to change tack from what I'd done in my last book, Lawless World, and actually track down and talk to all of the people involved in the story. And so for the next year and a half, I started in late 2005 conceiving of this idea and began to implement it, so to speak, in the summer of 2006. I met with every person who was involved in the decision-making process. And I spoke with everyone on the record, with the exception of one person, Jim Haynes, with whom I had an off-the-record conversation, but I'll say a bit more about that in due course. And what I discovered here was not only that there had been a crime, because the interrogation of Mohammed al-Qahtani, it turned out, on the basis of his interrogation log, which I was able to obtain, plainly violated the Geneva Conventions, and in particular Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which indicate that no one in detention is to be subject to abuse, no one is to be subject to outrages against human dignity, no one is to be subject to cruelty, and no one is to be tortured. The interrogation log showed that over a period of 54 days, between the 23rd of November 2002, in other words, a week before this memo was signed, and early January 2003, al-Qahtani was subject to 15 new techniques of interrogation, which were aimed at humiliating him and breaking him. Techniques that ranged from enforced nudity, the use of dogs to create fear, the use of extremes of temperature, hot and cold, sleep deprivation, 20-hour-long interrogations followed by 4 hours of broken sleep, constant white noise and very loud noise, a range of other techniques that you can use in the book, had the intention of breaking this man. Techniques, cumulatively, that plainly violated the Geneva Conventions. I needed to form a view as to how bad these techniques were. The definition of torture in international law is severe mental pain and suffering. And I took the interrogation log off to a clinical psychiatrist who works for the National Health Service and the Medical Foundation for the Victims of Torture, left it with her for a couple of weeks and said, tell me what level of abuse you consider this to amount to. And a couple of weeks later we met, and she went through the log, and she explained to me how, by reference to the indicators of distress, she had concluded this amounted to torture. It crossed that line. She also expressed the view that if you were to take 12 clinical psychiatrists and show them this document and ask the question, has this man been tortured, they would conclude that he had been tortured. The question that then emerged is how could this group of individuals, and in particular this group of lawyers, trained at Harvard Law Schools and other extremely select institutions, have reached the conclusion that this was permissible. And that was the story I wanted to get to the bottom of. So there was a crime. That was clear to me. What I discovered was that there was also a cover-up, and that the narrative that was explained by the administration was not an accurate account of what had happened. And that crime and that cover-up will have, it is clear, consequences. So take yourselves back now to early 2002. Detainees are arriving at Guantanamo. A new combatant commander is being selected. But an immediate problem is that there are international obligations reflected in the Geneva Conventions which impose constraints on the techniques of interrogation, Common Article 3. On the 7th of February 2002, President Bush adopts an executive order that determines in simple summary form, none of the detainees have any rights under the Geneva Conventions. That decision is of vital significance, and so the first person I needed to speak to was the person who had most influenced that decision, and that was a man called Doug Feith. Doug Feith was the number 3 in the Pentagon. He was the head of policy. He had, by the time I met him in 2007, left, or December 2006, left the Pentagon and was at Georgetown University. He generously agreed to meet with me through an introduction of a friend of mine who was working for the administration, and we had an on-the-record conversation. And he told me with great pride, literally great pride, the role he had played in ensuring that respect for the Geneva Conventions would be obtained by determining that they did not apply to anyone at Guantanamo. It's a sort of very curious logic, but essentially the argument that he constructed was that the Geneva Conventions only applied to those who followed the rules. If you gave effect to it to people who didn't follow the rules, you would destroy the incentive behind the Geneva Convention system, and therefore you were protecting the Geneva Conventions by not applying them to anyone at Guantanamo. It's a terrific logic. He's actually written this as far back as 1985 in an academic article that I knew about. And I put it to him, I said, Doug, isn't the consequence of this, by then we had reasonably cozied up, isn't the consequence of this that none of the constraints on interrogation would apply to anyone at Guantanamo? Without pausing, he turned and he said, absolutely, that was the point. Now pause there, because this comes to what Lord Wolfe said. You here get the first disconnect between what the administration is saying and what actually happened. You won't find the administration going around saying, oh, we decided we needed to interrogate these people harshly and therefore we got rid of Geneva. Not at all. We went through the mechanical application of the law, was their approach, and from what resulted, we were then able to do what we needed to do. And Doug Feith is essentially telling me that was not what happened. He was confirming for the first time what instinctually many people knew, that they had designed the policy and then fitted the law to accommodate the policy. He's very upset with my book. He's very upset. He's very upset with the article that appeared in Vanity Fair, which included his role as a central role. And he wrote a letter to Ghraib and Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair, complaining about my serial misquotations in the book, so numerous that he couldn't even mention them. And I was invited by the editor of Vanity Fair to respond, and that response will appear tomorrow in the July issue of Vanity Fair, which comes out online tomorrow, I believe. And it was very simple. I put in a one-line response. Mr. Feith has obviously forgotten that I recorded the interview. And Vanity Fair, being a publication which is very serious on fact-checking, many of you will not appreciate this, I received a visit from a Vanity Fair fact-checker who spent 5 days with me in London checking every single quotation by reference to the transcript and the audio. So the quotations are completely accurate, and you'll in due course learn why this becomes even more important. So that was step one. Okay, they've got rid of Geneva. I've established they got rid of Geneva from a decision at the top precisely in order to open the door to aggressive techniques of interrogation. The next person I found